At 2:14 a.m., 22,000 miles above the Earth, America's most advanced early warning satellite just blinked offline. 3 seconds later, the Link 16 data network connecting the entire Pacific Fleet goes dead. Inside the combat center of the USS Sovereign, the screens aren't showing red enemy targets. They're showing pure, terrifying static. Tehran hasn't just launched an attack. They have successfully blinded the most powerful military on Earth. 400 hypersonic missiles are currently descending from the stratosphere, and for the first time in modern history, the United States Navy cannot see them coming. But the enemy is about to learn a brutal lesson. A blinded giant is still a giant. Welcome to the reality of decentralized warfare. If you're frustrated by military stories that portray superpower technology as an invincible magic shield that never fails, you need to understand what happens when the screen actually goes black. For decades, the United States military has relied on a concept called the system of systems. It is an interlocking web of space-based infrared satellites, high-altitude drones, and encrypted data links. This network provides commanders with a godlike view of the battlefield. It allows an Aegis destroyer to see a missile launch the moment the rocket engine ignites, thousands of miles away. But what happens when that eye is gouged out? What happens when a multi-billion-dollar aircraft carrier is suddenly reduced to the technology of a World War II battleship, forced to fight in the dark? Tonight, Iran has executed the unthinkable. Deep within the Zagros Mountains, an electromagnetic pulse or a highly advanced cyber weapon has severed the umbilical cord of American military dominance. The space-based infrared system, the satellite network designed to detect the heat bloom of a missile launch, is completely silent. The United States forces in the Persian Gulf are completely isolated. And in that precise moment of absolute vulnerability, the underground silos in western Iran open their heavy steel doors. 400 solid-fuel ballistic missiles roar into the night sky. This is not a calculated warning shot. This is a saturation strike. The Iranian strategy relies on a simple, brutal mathematical equation. They know that a standard American destroyer has a finite number of interceptor missiles. They believe that if they blind the radar and flood the zone with hundreds of cheap, high-speed threats, the American defense computers will be overwhelmed. The artificial intelligence will freeze, unable to prioritize targets without satellite guidance, and the fleet will be annihilated. The missiles breach the atmosphere, coasting through the vacuum of space before beginning their terrifying descent back toward the ocean. They are moving at Mach 6, turning the air around them into glowing plasma. In exactly 11 minutes, they will impact the flight decks of the American fleet. The commanders in Tehran are already celebrating. They are staring at their own localized tracking screens, watching the swarm of 400 hypersonic killers arching perfectly toward the last known coordinates of the USS Sovereign. They have achieved the impossible. They have caught the American empire sleeping, and they have brought a knife to the throat of the United States Navy. But inside the Combat Information Center of the USS Sovereign, there is no panic. There are no sailors screaming or running for lifeboats. If you have ever wondered what makes a modern military truly lethal, it is not the satellites, and it is not the software. It is the cold, rehearsed professionalism of the operators when the software fails. The United States Navy does not just train for perfect conditions. They train for the apocalypse. They train for a doctrine known as a mission control, or EMP. When the Link 16 network collapsed and the screens turned to static, the captain of the Sovereign did not freeze. He simply shifted the paradigm of the war. With a single command, the multi-billion-dollar Aegis combat system is decoupled from the global satellite network. The ship stops, try to talk to Space Command in Colorado. Instead, the Sovereign and its escort destroyers activate a localized intra-ship mesh network. They create their own closed-loop ecosystem of data, completely disconnected from the outside world. The enemy believes that by destroying the macro-level communication, they have isolated the American ships. They fail to understand that a U.S. destroyer does not need permission from Washington to defend itself. The Aegis baseline computers immediately shift from global processing to autonomous, decentralized processing. The ship's own spy, 6 radar arrays, previously running in a passive receiving mode to avoid detection, now blast the sky with active, high-intensity radio frequency waves. They're no longer hiding. They're turning on the floodlights in a pitch-black room. The radar waves punch through the atmosphere, bouncing off the descending Iranian missiles. The static on the screens inside the Combat Information Center instantly dissolves, replaced by a terrifying cascade of jagged red icons. 400 targets, closing fast. The localized radar has found them, but without the early warning from space, the engagement window has been drastically reduced. Normally, the United States Navy prefers to intercept ballistic missiles while they are still in space, using the massive SM-3 interceptor. It is a clean, efficient way to vaporize a threat hundreds of miles above the Earth. But because the satellites were blinded, the SM-3s are useless. The Iranian missiles have already re-entered the atmosphere. The battle has shifted from the cold vacuum of space to the dense air just above the ocean. This is no longer a strategic interception. This is a kinetic knife fight in a telephone booth. The Iranian missiles are diving at a 70-degree angle, moving at over 3,000 miles per hour. The total time to impact is now less than 90 seconds. The margin for any error is absolutely zero. The Aegis artificial intelligence, running entirely on the localized servers of the Sovereign, begins prioritizing the 400 incoming threats based purely on their raw trajectory and speed. It calculates the exact moment each missile will cross the lethal threshold. The vertical launch system cells on the decks of the Sovereign and her escort destroyers fly open in a synchronized sequence. The missiles tearing out of the tubes are not the massive spacebound interceptors, but the SM-6. This missile is known as the Swiss Army knife of the United States Navy, specifically designed to hunt targets maneuvering through the thick air inside the atmosphere. The Iranian commanders watch their telemetry, anticipating a massive explosive duel in the sky. But they fail to understand the fundamental difference between their 20th century explosive philosophy and 21st century American defense. The United States Patriot and Standard missile systems do not rely on traditional explosive warheads, where a single fuse failure can render the weapon useless. Instead, the American interceptors utilize hit-to-kill technology. They use their own immense speed and mass to slam directly into the incoming warhead with millimeter precision. Imagine firing a bullet to intercept another bullet traveling at Mach 6 in midair. That is exactly the mathematical calculation the localized Aegis system is performing hundreds of times per second. The kinetic energy alone from the impact is enough to vaporize an Iranian warhead, turning a lethal threat into a harmless cloud of dust before it can even trigger its detonator. Our enemies have always taken pride in their massive steel weapons, but they fail to understand that in modern warfare, steel and explosives matter far less than code and algorithms. High above the Persian Gulf, a mathematical massacre begins. The SM-6 interceptors find their targets, clipping the tails of the enemy warheads and causing them to tumble and disintegrate. The sky is filled with silent, violent orange flashes, but the enemy is desperate. As the hypersonic ballistic missiles draw the attention of the heavy interceptors, a secondary threat emerges from the Iranian coastline. Dozens of low-cost suicide drones and coastal anti-ship missiles are launched simultaneously from fast attack boats and hidden trailers. This is a classic tactical trap. The goal is saturation, hoping to force the American commanders to choose between the hypersonic killers falling from the sky and the swarms buzzing toward their hulls at sea level. To the minds in Tehran, this two-pronged attack against a blinded fleet should guarantee a kill. But the Aegis computers are capable of tracking over 100 targets simultaneously, prioritizing them based entirely on their time to impact. As the surviving fragments of the ballistic missiles and the fastest drones breach the final defensive perimeter, the close-in weapon systems wake up. The Phalanx CWS, known by sailors as R2, D2 with a gun, slews its 20mm Gatling gun toward the plunging debris. It operates entirely on its own, locking onto the falling fragments and letting out a terrifying burst that sounds like a giant zipper being pulled. A wall of tungsten bullets shreds the remaining threats into pieces the size of coins. Yet, the sheer volume of the Iranian swarm threatens to deplete the Sovereign's magazines. The American commanders realize that playing a purely kinetic numbers game against thousands of cheap drones is exactly what the enemy wants. If the Navy cannot shoot them all down with missiles, they must change the laws of physics governing the battlefield. With the space-based early warning networks still down, the standard wideband electronic jamming from aircraft like the EA-18G Growler is deployed, blasting a wall of high-powered electronic noise to scramble the drone's GPS signals. But Iran anticipated this. They transitioned their swarm to electro-optical and thermal tracking, immune to standard radio frequency jamming. The American ships are emitting massive heat signatures, and the drones are flying purely by sight, blind to the electronic static. It is here, in the darkest moment of the engagement, that the United States Navy deploys its ultimate outlier, an aircraft built not for brute force, but for cognitive electronic warfare. The EC-37B Compass Call enters the airspace. Unlike the Growler, which attempts to shout louder than the enemy's sensors, the EC-37B is designed to fundamentally rewrite the enemy's internal logic. Circling at the edge of the engagement zone, the aircraft activates its software suite, initiating a high-speed scan of the Iranian coastal defense grid. The compass call is looking for the air gap, while the Iranian command lines are buried deep underground in fiber optic cables. Their automated drone swarm requires physical junction boxes and satellite uplinks to receive final targeting adjustments. At these specific hardware interfaces, minute electromagnetic pulses leak from the decoding equipment during high-speed data transfers. The EC-37B locks onto these microscopic leaks. Using injection spoofing, the American mission computer synthesizes data packets that precisely mimic the proprietary handshake of the Iranian command protocols. The United States does not block the enemy's signal. It seamlessly inserts itself into the communication stream. In a fraction of a second, the EC-37B executes a high-precision digital manipulation. It hacks directly into the target recognition software of the incoming Iranian swarm. Through the manipulated junction boxes, the United States Navy ships are digitally relabeled within the enemy's own computers as friendly support craft, while the Iranian flagship and coastal command centers are suddenly reclassified as hostile, high-value American targets. The deception is absolute. The Iranian drones and remaining missiles, blindly following their compromised programming, abruptly alter their trajectories. The commanders in Tehran stare at their screens in horror as their own weapons bypass the American fleet entirely. The swarm violently turns back toward the Iranian coast, locking onto the massive thermal and optical signatures of their own launch facilities and flagships. The Iranian Defense Network, through its own automated efficiency and the United States Navy's systemic exploit, has just directed a devastating strike against itself. Imagine the sheer panic inside the underground bunkers of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. They had spent decades and billions of dollars building a layered defense network and an overwhelming swarm capability. They believed they had achieved the impossible by blinding the American satellites. But they failed to realize that when you fight the United States military, you are not just fighting hardware. You are fighting a living, thinking digital organism that turns your own strength into a fatal vulnerability. The roar of their own missiles turning back upon them is the sound of a total algorithmic existential crisis. Their multi-million-dollar assets are no longer aimed at the Sovereign. They're frantically chasing a digital illusion created by American intelligence. The confidence of the enemy evaporates, replaced by the primal fear of realizing they're facing an entity capable of warping their own reality. The sky above the Persian Gulf begins to clear. The violent orange flashes fade, replaced by the eerie, quiet glow of burning debris raining down upon the ocean surface. Inside the Combat Information Center of the USS Sovereign, the atmosphere remains at a constant, calculated chill of 19 degrees Celsius. There are no cheers. There are no high fives or stirring speeches from the captain. To the men and women of the United States Navy, this was not a historic, desperate battle for survival. It was a minor technical anomaly, resolved strictly according to mathematical protocol. The Sovereign and her escorts never dropped a single knot of velocity. They never deviated from their course by so much as a single degree on the compass. But the engagement is far from over. In the world of amateurs, surviving an overwhelming surprise attack is considered a miracle. In United States military doctrine, survival is merely the stepping stone to an execution. The commanders in Tehran made their final, most fatal miscalculation. They believed that by blinding the American satellites and cutting off the Link 16 communication network, they would prevent Washington from ordering a counterattack. They failed to understand that severing communication did not paralyze the American fleet. It simply removed the restrictive rules of engagement. Without a direct line to the politicians in Washington, the localized mesh network of the Sovereign defaults to its pre-programmed autonomous retaliation protocols. Every single missile and drone launched by the enemy acted as an invisible umbilical cord, leading directly back to the throat of the aggressor. Running purely on local quantum servers, the Aegis system activates a reverse mapper algorithm. It analyzes the initial velocity, the trajectory arcs, and the precise angles of descent of the 400 defeated threats. In a matter of seconds, the artificial intelligence peels back the layers of the Iranian defense grid, drawing a geometric funnel straight back to the launch facilities hidden within the Zagros Mountains and along the coastline. Simultaneously, the localized sonar arrays beneath the hull of the Sovereign detect a microsecond transient anomaly. It is the faint mechanical shudder of a torpedo tube. An Iranian Stux-class submarine has been sitting motionless at a depth of nearly 300 meters, tucked behind a geological rift known as the Death Trench. The crew inside has powered down every electronic device, hoping that the chaos above would provide them a shroud of invisibility. But through the eyes of the Sovereign's autonomous network, that silent submarine is glowing as bright as a lighthouse in the dead of night. The order is given. From the aft flight deck, an MH-90 Ghost Hawk helicopter surges into the sky. It does not search blindly. It flies to coordinates precise to the centimeter, drops its active sonar sensor into the water, and begins to scream into the ocean with high-intensity acoustic pulses. It is physical and psychological torture for the crew trapped below, shivering in their obsolete steel tube. Seconds later, a Mark 60 Reaper lightweight torpedo plunges into the water. It glides with the lethal silence of a true phantom, chasing the thermal signature down into the abyss. There is no massive water column, only a peak acoustic shockwave echoing back to the sensors as the hull of the enemy submarine is snapped like a hollow can under immense pressure. The ocean permanently swallows Tehran's pride. But the true wrath of the United States is taking shape above the water. The vertical launch cells of the Sovereign and her escort destroyers fly open once more. This time, they are not firing interceptors. 72 Tomahawk Block 5 cruise missiles scream out of their tubes, carving smoke trails across the horizon. These are not blind rockets. Each Tomahawk carries three-dimensional digital mapping and autonomous infrared target recognition. They do not just fly to a target. They hunt it with the persistence of a professional predator. While the Tomahawks fly low to shatter the coastal radar installations, a far more terrifying shadow slips into Iranian airspace. High above the chaos, operating completely undetected, a pair of B-2 Spirit stealth bombers have already arrived. They have been loitering at the edge of the combat zone, waiting for the electronic warfare aircraft to punch a hole in the sky. The enemy once boasted that their missile silos and command centers, buried beneath dozens of meters of granite and reinforced concrete, were impenetrable. Today, they will learn a new definition of penetration. The bomb bay doors of the B-2 Spirits open, releasing the monsters known as the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator. Weighing over 13 tons, these bunker busters are designed with a single purpose. They drop like the nails of God. They do not explode on impact. They drill through 60 meters of solid mountain rock and reinforced concrete like a hot knife through butter, reaching the deeply buried operations centers before detonating their massive explosive cores. The earth beneath the Zagros Mountains is shudders from a man-made earthquake. Entire fortified structures, worth hundreds of millions of dollars, are pulverized from the inside out. The very underground silos that launched the initial massive swarm are instantly transformed into smoldering, gaping craters. Ammunition depots suffer catastrophic secondary explosions, sending black plumes of smoke thousands of meters into the air. In exactly 33 minutes from the moment the first Iranian missile was launched, the United States Navy has executed a flawless defense and an overwhelming total retaliation. 24 high-priority enemy bases have been permanently erased from the map. The entire launch infrastructure, the elite engineering crews, and the command centers have been neutralized. The morning sun begins to rise over the Persian Gulf, casting its light on a completely altered geopolitical landscape. Tehran spent billions of dollars and decades of research building what they believed was an unstoppable swarm. They thought they had achieved the ultimate strategic victory by blinding the American satellites and severing the data links. But they brought 20th century explosive logic to challenge a 21st century mathematical empire. The United States military does not just dominate because of its hardware. It dominates because of the unyielding, cold proficiency of its operators and the decentralized autonomy of its systems. When you cut off the head of the American military network, you do not kill the beast. You simply isolate its limbs, and those limbs are heavily armed, highly trained, and fully capable of operating in the dark. A Nimitz-class carrier and its strike group represent an investment of over $19 billion and the lives of thousands of American sailors. The return on that investment is absolute deterrence. Today, the enemy learned that the American shield is impenetrable and the American sword is limitless. They attempted to strike a blinded giant, and the giant crushed them without ever needing to open its eyes. The world order has been violently re-established, not through empty diplomatic threats, but through lines of code, kinetic slugs traveling at Mach 6, and the absolute dominance of American military technology. The strait remains open, the fleet sails forward, and the rules of the ocean remain unchanged.